Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Nick Gianos. I'm on the partnerships team here at Atlassian. I'm excited to introduce you to Jay Uris and Curtis Reese, both solutions architects at AWS. A little bit about them. Curtis has a focus on modern app development practices through containers. He enjoys helping customers simplify and resolve frequent pain points and become more agile and capable while implementing containerized workloads. Jay brings over 20 years of experience in various technical roles. He is a domain expert in building highly technical cloud architectures, and he's passionate about leading strategic initiatives to help customers embrace the DevOps culture. So please join me in welcoming Curtis and Jay.
Thanks everybody. I really appreciate you coming to our session. I know there's other choices, so I just want to say thank you for choosing us. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you are managing lifecycle of your applications in Jira today? Okay, pretty good chunk of you. How many of you are actually managing the integrations with Jira and other solutions? Okay. So today we're going to talk about managing application lifecycle using Jira with Bitbucket Cloud and AWS tooling. The talk is really going to be focused more around integrations. So we want to show some simple ways to simplify that story of managing a lifecycle of applications using Jira and outside tooling. So let's first talk about the problem space. So the idea here is that you're managing the lifecycle of your applications. You're trying to track what's going on, issues, trying to monitor and report back in. But you might not be managing the entire lifecycle within Atlassian tooling. So imagine that you're using CI/CD outside of Atlassian. So you have to report out. Something has to happen, and it has to report back in to report whether that was successful or not. So we want to talk a little bit about making that simple, and we're going to leverage a number of different tools along the way. So let me go ahead and pass it over to Jay to get started.
Why, thank you, Curtis. So when we're talking about the problem space and the tools that we're using, let's just start with a real quick question. So why do you need Jira? Or better yet, consider how do you effectively convince skeptics within your organization about the value of this tool and how that can help them as well. So it's a fact that companies are moving to the cloud. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. So this is happening at a point where we believe that cloud is the new normal. And as companies are moving to the cloud and doing those migrations, it becomes increasingly important to offer integrations to services and tools that are used both on-prem and in the cloud and all these other combinations that are going to help expedite the tracking of lifecycle of applications. So at the end of the day, it's really about the customer experience, right? Your organization wants to deliver an exceptional customer experience, and that's critical to any business in today's competitive market. So along with the fact that we're living in a digital age, and with that comes agility and being able to implement tools that work effectively across the organization to help you deliver that experience to your customers. So the good news is that the tools exist today. You don't have to wait for that. Jira provides the framework to bring together your entire organization in a seamless and integrated manner. So what are some of the steps that you can take today to ensure that you succeed? The first of this is really changing the organizational behavior, right? So organizations have traditionally been or taken a siloed approach when it comes to operating even internally, right? This hierarchy needs to be removed. So we're going to also define the process. That process should be one that is not just limited to your own departmental perspective, but also extends beyond that to the entire organization, sharing that knowledge across all teams. So a great use case for this is when tracking issues through each of the various stages of the release. If your release process exists entirely with Atlassian products, like Bitbucket Cloud and Jira, then this is relatively straightforward. But is that always the case? Do you have solutions in your, or tooling in your existing organization that are not within that scope, are using hybrids of, different partner toolings or things like that along with Atlassian products? Then it starts to not become so clear. But I'm very excited to come today and share with you some of the work that Curtis and I have been building in terms of building out these integrations with these tools. And this brings us to the technical portion, right, while you're all here. So I wanted to take a few moments to kind of go through one of these integrations. The first integration that we want to share with you is leveraging the Atlassian Connect add-on. And what we've done with this is we've integrated that to our own AWS code suite. So AWS Code Pipeline, Code Build, Code Commit can now integrate with Jira by virtue of this Connect add-on. So I've offered you a reference architecture as an example. Now, I know it can seem a little daunting, and there's a lot of stuff on the screen, but I'm going to walk you through what each of those components are. So with this reference architecture, we have a representation of one way that we could implement this integration. And at the core of this integration, we start off with that Atlassian Connect add-on. Now, our friends at Atlassian were nice enough to open source this, so it's publicly available. And there's a few versions of this that have been published. So for the purpose of this integration, I opted to choose the Spring Boot Starter, which is the officially supported version by Atlassian. And we've incorporated that in part of the sample code that's going to be available here, right? But it's a Spring Boot application. How are we going to run this? So one approach that I took was taking that application's base, the source code, and packaging a fat jar. Great, I have a fat jar. Now what do I do with it? Well, what I did with that is I built a Docker image that's going to run that application. So I've containerized it. Take it a step further. I'm now launching this into our AWS Fargate container management service. So fully managed solution, you're able to run container workloads without having to manage that infrastructure. There's more. The other part of this integration involves tying back into our full CI/CD suite. We're using the AWS Code Suite of services, Code Pipeline, Code Build, and Code Commit. So I provide a reference architecture for that as well, and you have a full CI/CD pipeline. And we're using AWS Lambda. AWS Lambda is going to be included as part of this as well, with some example code that's going to be based off Node.js, leveraging the AWS SDK, and querying the Code Suite APIs to gather data from that pipeline. Things that you would expect, like the commit ID, the author, the message, build status. So as your application is going through the pipeline and stages are changing and updating, you're getting all of this information collected by virtue of these Lambda functions that are getting invoked, and then sending that JSON payload with all that data to your Atlassian Connect app running on Fargate. That application is then going to authenticate on your behalf to your Jira instance in the cloud, and it's going to update that, your Jira instance with that information. So providing you a single pane of glass, you can continue to work within Jira, and you're going to be able to see in near real time updates as they're going through your pipeline. There's more detail here, because again, I wanted to take a step further and not only show you how to build the integration, but along the way show you some best practices on how to incorporate other AWS services together and how these can interoperate to build a comprehensive solution, giving you a reference to allow you to immerse yourself in these services, not so much in how to build the integration itself, but how you can apply them to other use cases as well within your environment. So I mentioned Lambda. We have CloudWatch events that are going to trigger off of state changes of our pipeline. I mentioned the container that we're building, that Docker image. We're storing that in ECR, our registry for containers. We're using Certificate Manager to issue certificates to our network load balancer that's sitting in front of that Fargate cluster. with HTTPS traffic that's required in order to register your application. And then we're also using Secrets Manager, because part of this really involves getting the token from your Jira instance and authenticating, right? The application needs to authenticate. So we're storing that securely. So as part of our build process in this example, it's almost iterating on itself. We're capturing the code, we're building it, containerizing it, we're passing those secrets securely, and we're launching this. So, great picture, right, Jay? I'm sure you're thinking, well, how do I build this? Worry not. So what you see here is a website. I've put together my learnings as I've been building this integration, and there's a public website that you can go to, and I'm going to take you step by step on all this information that I'm sharing with details. There's also going to be sample code, because behind this website, there's a GitHub repo that's off of our AWS samples org on GitHub that's going to have everything. The Lambda functions are there, the CloudFormation templates are there, reference architecture diagrams are there, you have it all, including the content that is used to build these static pages, right? So I wanted to take this approach because I wanted to help you, enable you on learning how these services come together and how you build this integration, so that then you can take this in turn and build your own Connect app, your own version of this. And in the process of doing that, you're getting prescriptive guidance, you're getting best practices, and you're getting an immersion to our AWS services and how these work together. I'll share the URL at the end, I promise. So I have a diagram here to kind of go through the process of what you should expect when you start working on this, right? So it's a self-paced workshop, as I mentioned. When you do this, you can stop whenever you like, continue. It's at your discretion. What you should expect is from the moment you start the workshop, we're going to mitigate one thing. It works on my machine, doesn't work on your machine. For that, we're going to do a deployment of Cloud9. Now, if you're not familiar with Cloud9, Cloud9 is our cloud-based IDE. And the reason that I included that as part of this workshop, again, is to level set. So I don't want you to struggle. I want this to be as seamless as possible for you. Cloud9 provides that environment because in a one-click deployment, you'll have an instance that you can use in the cloud. And then you can take the approach, if you'd like, of monkey see, monkey do. We'll just go through the examples, copy and paste, everything's working. But you also have that additional content in the form of those pages that elaborate on why I chose these solutions and how these things are working together. From that Cloud9 environment, you'll have a terminal, and you'll be able to use the AWS CLI and a couple of other tools to kind of go through a very methodical process of building out this foundation. We'll use CloudFormation, and we'll invoke these templates from our Cloud9 environment. You'll have access to the GitHub repo. I encourage you to fork a copy of that repo into your own accounts. Once you're in your Cloud9 instance, you can clone that, and now you'll have local content in your Cloud9 environment that you can use, right? Then we'll start with deploying these in a phased manner. We'll start with our container registry. I'll show you the steps that I took to build that fat jar, to build that Docker image. You'll be able to push that content to your registry on your AWS account. You'll launch another CloudFormation template that'll launch that Fargate cluster for you. It really will be that simple. One-click deployments along the way with valuable information in every step. I'll show you how to deploy a full CI/CD pipeline using our code suite of services, and you'll have the sample code for those Lambda functions and instructions on how to enable those so that as those events go down the pipeline, you trigger those Lambda functions, get that data, and then hopefully see that end result in Jira. Does that sound great? All right.
Cool. Thanks, Jay. So as shown with Atlassian Connector, we can make it easier to integrate with AWS services, especially in scenarios where you may be managing the lifecycle of your applications in Jira, but you may be handling CI/CD in an external environment, in this scenario, AWS. But what if you're managing the entire lifecycle of your application, including CI/CD from within Atlassian tools? Well, for that, I'm going to talk about Bitbucket Pipes and our integration with AWS Fargate. So I've built an integration there that will help you deploy it in a much more simplified manner. So before we get into that, what I want to talk about is a little bit of why we built it and the process and the mindset we had. And so to kind of dive into that, think about, well, Bitbucket Pipelines allows you to customize your pipeline to make it as simple or as complex as you need. Pipes allow you to abstract a lot of that complexity out. So if any of you are familiar with the process of going towards things like microservices, so it's the idea of taking what was traditionally a monolithic code base and abstracting away essentially the unitaskers, things that do one thing and do them really well. That's really a good pitch for pipes here. So if you're looking at an example pipeline.yaml, if you're deploying to AWS and you're having to call multiple CLIs, and you're having to respond to feedback for those and test those and respond, each step of your pipeline can actually get quite large. But by abstracting it away, we can simplify that. And so the idea here is with this pipe, we want to increase the quality of your actual CI/CD processes. We want to simplify and aid in the reuse. So if you're copying and pasting between stages with simple changes, you're less likely to cause issues with copy and paste errors. You can actually simplify it and make it more legible and readable. And we also want you to be able to dive into some of the best practices. So I'll get into some of that in a little bit. To start, there are some prerequisites. So first and foremost, the idea here is that you're going to be deploying to a Fargate app running in AWS. So naturally, you're going to need to have an AWS account to run that in already. So you'll need to walk through that process, provision your networking, provision the home essentially for it, so the cluster for your Fargate task. You'll need to create an Amazon ECR repository. So the pipe is based off of using Amazon ECR. So it's closer proximity to your AWS resources, and we can simplify the policy and access controls a little bit more there. And then you need to be able to upload your application to that repository. So once you've containerized the app, created that image, done whatever scanning and processes you need to do on that, you can actually push that into ECR. Chances are that's going to be one of the preliminary stages of your pipeline, or it's going to be another pipeline in and of itself. But those are the prereqs. So once you have that in place, you're ready to actually start putting the pipe into place. So the second step you're going to have to do is you're going to need to set up some environmental variables. The idea here is that anything that's going to be sensitive, we want to pull out and use repository variables. So we're going to pull out your, say, account IDs for AWS. We're going to pull out access keys and secrets. One of the best practices when deploying these types of workloads is to have separate accounts for each tier of your application. So dev is a separate account from production typically. And so you're going to have multiple credentials and access there in a best practice kind of world. So we want you to go through and kind of abstract those out. So at its base, you're looking at an access key ID, a secret access key, the registry URL. If you want to store it here, you can dynamically generate that through a previous stage. If you're doing a push to ECR, you can actually get that back from it. We want the account IDs, and then any groups, such as the ELB target groups, that you want that load balancer if you're going to have a load balancer on the Fargate. So it's a couple steps, but you can store these here, and chances are these are going to be pretty idempotent, so they're not going to change very frequently. After that, we need you to create a task definition. And so how many of you have actually deployed containers to AWS today? A few of you, okay. Are you using the CLI to do that? No? Okay. Well, chances are if you're going to build this into your pipeline definition, and it's going to be part of a step in your pipeline, chances are you're calling the actual CLI to actually push your container workloads. When you do that, you have two options to send the details and the definition of that particular task, which is what we call that workload. You can send it as a string that's dynamically generated in real time when you make the request, or you can send it as a file. My recommendation here is that you send it as a file. And there's a couple reasons for that, but the predominant one is that you're actually getting the definition out of what could be dynamic and changing based on each step of your deploy if you're in an end-tier architecture, and you're getting that into infrastructure as code. So now it's versioned, it can be linted, you can see what changes people are making. The definition file basically manages the the resources that that container has, the sidecar configuration, network configuration. And so if you were spinning up infrastructure, typically you would want to version that infrastructure and make sure that people aren't having too much fun with it. So we want to increase the safety here. So we want you to pull that out into a file that the pipe can reference, and from there, you're good to go. So now we go through and we're going to set up the pipe. It's pretty straightforward. You have a step in your pipeline, so you're going to go through and provide a name. So here I've got, I think I have a laser too. So we've got the name of the step. We're going to reference the script for it. We're going to call the pipe, and so you can see the pipe URL there. So it's going to go out to Bitbucket, or GitHub, Docker Hub, let's get that right. It's going to go out to Docker Hub. It's going to grab our pipe. It's going to pull it into Bitbucket pipelines, and then it's going to use the variables that you've set up here to actually go through and execute that and provision your workload. And if you're looking at this, it looks like it's a lot of variables, and I admit that. It seems like a lot, but there's an explanation as to why this is actually still valuable. And so let's go to the next slide, and we'll see. So on the left side, we have an example pipeline that is going to basically execute a script. Oh, wrong button. It's going to execute the script. So we're going to have our repo. It's going to create a task name. It's going to create a task version. It's going to specify basically our task definition here as string. It's going to call the AWS CLI. And what you can see on the left is the script is so long, and this is just one deploy, it doesn't even fit on the screen here. And so imagine you've got people working on multiple tiers of this application, and they need to make a change to it. They're going to have to make that change in multiple places. You miss a comma, you miss something else in here, you basically hose that deploy. And so what we want to do is kind of abstract as much of that complexity out as possible and convert it to what's on the right. So the right side, pardon the bold, is a little bit more legible. It's consistent. So as you have multiple steps in your deployment, those steps are going to be very consistent and readable. And so when you actually go to do the deploy, it's simplified. And then what's going to happen is when that gets run, it's going to leverage the best practices that are put into that pipe. And so that pipe is going to execute those workloads based on the best practices set by AWS and largely the community. We're, like Jay's connector, we're open sourcing this. And so you'll be able to submit issues to it, you'll be able to submit pull requests, and be able to grow it as the capabilities of the platform continue to grow. So you don't necessarily have to keep track of all of those things and update your command line interfaces. You just need to keep track of what the variables are. So it's essentially using a service to deploy that and ensuring consistency and safety of those deploys, especially over time.
It's our connector, by the way.
Yeah, it's
We're sharing it.
our connector.
We're
Ours
working
is
on
in
it
the
together.
community. So I think I skipped ahead one. Nope, best practices. So tying this back into the Jira side, if you're managing all of this from within Atlassian tools, and you've set up the connector between Jira Cloud and Bitbucket Cloud, everything's going to act the same ways that you would expect. You're still going to be able to go into your Jira dashboards and see the deployments as they succeed or fail. You're going to be able to see what changes and commits have been pushed out successfully. Even though the deployment is actually happening in AWS, the pipe will actually report back success failure information. You can dive into, if there's an issue with it, you can actually see when you go into the pipeline deploy itself, the execution, you can see what went on with it at the various stages of the pipe. So it gives you a lot of ability to introspect and actually look at what's going on there and still tie back into Jira. So it doesn't affect your actual lifecycle management. It ties right into it as you would expect. With that, we're going to start our little wrap up. That's what we have. As I mentioned earlier, that's the Bitbucket pipe is still in progress. We're getting that out soon to you. And once it's out, we'll share a link on our website. We're going to have a blog post as well. And then you as the community will have full reign of it. And one other thing that I do want to mention, so I'll back this up, going back into the best practices here. The idea is we're building this based on what we think is best practices, but what you as a user might need in your particular environment may be different than what we anticipate. And so one of the benefits of doing this in the Bitbucket pipeline pipe is that you can actually fork our pipe. So you can take our code base, follow the documentation from Atlassian, and you can make your own pipe. So you can extend it, you can make it better, you can tie in specific things that you want or processes that you need, and then you've got your own pipe. That simplicity and that flexibility is really important. And you can still base that off of our best practices, and you can continue to grow it as we grow the community version as well.
Real quick, can we go to the slide with the URL for the folks? It's a couple over.
Distraction.
There it is. It's pretty hard to read. I don't know if we'll be able to, Nick, will we be able to send this in the app? Yeah, okay. So we'll give you the URL. As I mentioned before, there's a GitHub repo behind all of this. Please, I encourage you to share this with colleagues and let's contribute together. If you find any issues with it, you'll be able to log an issue, better yet, a pull request if you find something that is grossly wrong. But I hope you enjoy going through the workshop. I wrote it with the intent that it helps you, so thank you.
Well, we're not done yet.
We're not.
Let's summarize some stuff.
Oh, my bad.
So the idea of going back to some of the initial slides, the idea is if you take a customer-first approach where you're focusing on the customer's needs and you're providing transparency with your internal teams, so being able to, if you're, say, in a microservice-based environment, being able to see what other teams are doing, so say you have a service you need to consume, having that transparency and being able to see what that team is working on, what their roadmap looks like, what issues they're having, will definitely help you and your teams along the way. Being able to be upfront and collaborate more effectively, especially if you're in a heterogeneous environment where you're doing stuff on-prem, in AWS, in other environments, being able to see that from one place definitely really helps the situation. And by using Jira, you get a lot of that flexibility and that power and that extensibility. And what we've shown today is that while some of that may seem complicated, there are ways to simplify it tremendously. And what we've done here is tried to leverage some of those integrations. So the call to action, as Jay was suggesting, is we can definitely take that free workshop. Unfortunately, the theater talks have passed, but we will be at the booth later today. So if you have questions about this process or how to integrate with Atlassian and AWS tooling further, definitely come talk to us.